So you'll know the quote well, now abideth faith, hope and love, these three, but the greatest of these is love. So I think the essence of our calling as ambassadors as brothers of Christ, as ambassadors of Christ, is really boiled down to those three things, isn't it? Faith, hope and love. And this morning I want to focus on faith and just pose the question, what is faith to you? And if we're all together, I might sort of ask you a definition of faith, and no doubt the McKinleys who are next on my screen will put their hand up and trot out Hebrews 11 verse 1 and say the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen, from Hebrews 11 verse 1. But what is faith to you personally? How do you know you have it? How do you grow it? What does faith look like? And in many of our minds, I guess, particularly as young guys, we might be thinking of the amazing acts of Hebrews 11 verse 33 and 34, about men and women who through faith subdued kingdoms and brought righteousness and obtained promises and stopped the mouths of lions and quenched the violence of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, out of weakness were made strong, waxed valiant in flight, and turned to flight the armies of the aliens. So that might be what faith looks like to us, these amazing acts of courage and bravery. David facing off against Goliath, Gideon against the Midianites, Moses facing up to Pharaoh. And yes, of course, these are all amazing acts of courage motivated by faith. But they're not exactly everyday acts, are they? We're not called, every day to front up to Pharaoh and say, let my people go. And yet we are required to develop faith every day. So I'm going to suggest a slightly different perspective on faith to you this morning. So an idea that you've probably heard before, but you might not have. But an idea that I hope you'll at least think about. And the idea of this is that the foundation of faith is humility, and the enemy of faith is pride. Now, this is one of those ideas that I'd sort of wish I'd known as a younger man, as a School of the Prophets attendee. I guess when we're young, especially when we're young men, I guess we can be under the impression that we have to be zealous about the truth, defending the doctrinal and the moral principles of the Bible against everyone and anyone. And of course, there is a place for that from time to time. But zeal itself is not evidence of faith. And a combative attitude is, I think, probably an evidence of a lack of faith. If we're fighting battles for the sake of it, it may well be evidence of fear or of pride rather than of faith. So if faith is a complete reliance on God rather than a reliance on self, then faith in your life is much more likely to be demonstrated through humility and gentleness rather than in fighting the external opponents of the truth. So that's the image of faith that I want to put forward this morning, that faith is really a complete reliance on God rather than a reliance on self. So David, of course, spent years as a humble shepherd before his 10-minute fight against Goliath. And Moses spent 40 years as a humble shepherd before his, what might have been a 1-month battle against Pharaoh. So if we're called to show faith every day, I think it's much more likely to be in the form of humility than in fighting the battles of God. So the foundation of faith is humility. The undoing of faith is pride. Let's have a look and see if this is in fact a biblical principle. We're going to start in the Old Testament. So if you can flick back to Habakkuk 2 and verse 4. Habakkuk chapter 2 and verse 4. I'll give you a few seconds to find the minor prophets. So the word faith, at least in the King James Version, so in this English translation of the Bible, King James, the English word faith is only translated as such twice in the King James Old Testament. And it's once here in Habakkuk 2 verse 4 and once in Deuteronomy 32 and verse 20. So Habakkuk 2 verse 4 says, behold, his soul which is lifted up is not upright in him, but the just shall live by faith. So you've read the last part of that verse probably a few times, the just shall live by faith, because of course it's quoted 3 times in the New Testament, in Romans, in Galatians, and in Hebrews. So, and it's one of those great foundation quotes for Paul's thesis that we're saved by faith. And in fact, we've always been saved by faith, whether we lived under the law of Moses or in Abraham's time, or if, like us, we lived after Christ's death and resurrection. So no matter when we lived, we are saved by faith. And New Testament writers use this verse in Habakkuk 2 and verse 4, use it 3 times to show that we've always been saved by faith. And yet, how many times have you read the first part of this verse? So the 2 halves of the verse really form a contrast, don't they? In the first half, we've got a soul who's lifted up, which is not upright. And then that's contrasted to those who live by faith and who are just. So it's really a contrast between the person whose soul has been lifted up and the person who lives by faith. We've got a choice. We can either be just or we can be not upright. And what determines this? Well, we either live by faith or our soul is lifted up. Now, the ESV and the RV and the ASV all translate this phrase, behold, his soul is puffed up. So the Hebrew word, I guess appropriately, is pronounced awful, and it means to swell or be elated. And of course, even today, we sort of describe someone with an inflated opinion of themselves as being full of pride, as having a swollen head or something like that. So the idea of being swollen is what this idea of being puffed up or lifted up really means. So we've really got it right here in this sort of foundation verse in Habakkuk 2 verse 4, haven't we? The contrast is clear. Either we can be lifted up in pride or we can live by faith. And that's really the contrast here in Habakkuk, a contrast between faith or pride. And that's really our 2 options. Either we live by self-reliance or we live in reliance of God. It's either faith or it's pride. So pride is really the undoing of faith. Come across to the New Testament now. Have a look at Luke chapter 17. And we've really got a very key question here in Luke chapter 17 and verse 5. So Luke chapter 17 and verse 5. And here's our question, of course. The apostles say unto the Lord in Luke chapter 17 and verse 5, increase our faith. And that's what we want, isn't it? That's our aim, partly for this weekend and really for the rest of our life. If the key to a godly life is faith, surely we want to increase our faith. So how does Jesus answer this all-important question? Well, he gives not 1, but 2 parables. And he gives the parable of the mustard seed in Luke 17 and verse 6. And then he gives the parable of the unprofitable servant in verse 7 to 10. So 2 very, pretty short parables. One of the mustard seed, and then the parable of the unprofitable servant. And that might seem a little bit confusing to us. How do these 2 parables answer the question about increasing our faith? We really have to ask what the common characteristic between these 2 things, the mustard seed, which he mentions in verse 6, and the servant is. And I think the common characteristic is humility. So think about the mustard seed that he talks about in verse 6 of Luke 17. If you have faith as a grain of mustard seed, what's the defining characteristic of a mustard seed? Well, we just have to look at Mark chapter 4 and verse 31, and it tells us that the mustard seed is less than all the seeds that be in the earth. It's the least of all the seeds. Its defining characteristic is that it's tiny, it's small. In other words, it's humble. It's the opposite of being puffed up that we saw in Habakkuk. What about the servant that he follows up with in Luke chapter 17 and verse 7 to 10? What's the defining characteristic of this servant? Well, the defining characteristic really is that he works all day in the field and then he comes home and has to serve his master's personal needs before ever serving himself. So his defining characteristic is that he puts others' needs before his own, and yet still sees himself as an unprofitable servant. So at the end of verse 10 there of Luke 17, we say we are unprofitable servants. We've done that which was our duty to do. We're just doing our job, in other words. His defining characteristic, I think, again, is humility. So if you want to know how to increase our faith, we ask Christ. Christ gives us the answer. If you want to increase your faith, then you need to increase your humility. Decrease yourself, make yourself smaller, elevate others. And that, I think, is really the basis, the foundation of faith. Now, this characteristic of humility is an elusive characteristic, isn't it? If you think you've got it, you probably won't, because merely thinking that you have it, of course, makes our pride grow and humility diminish. So even talking about humility, of course, is difficult. So I'm sort of aware of the irony of me pontificating about this subject even this morning. But the idea of humility is really found in this concept that Jesus talks about in Luke 17, this concept of smallness. So Jesus, in other places in the New Testament that you'll probably know, describes people who are poor in spirit. They're small in their own spirit. He describes people who have the attitude of little children. He describes the basis of faith, as we've seen, as a grain of mustard seed, which he says is less than all the seeds that are in the earth. So it's really this attitude that says, I'm an unprofitable servant, I'm insignificant, my needs are less important, my spirit is poor, my ego is small. So when you think about it, I think it's really logical that faith is based on humility, that pride is the opposite of faith. A proud person is self-centered, is self-confident, is self-reliant. But a humble person knows that they can't do it on their own. They know that they're completely reliant on God for everything. And reliance on God is faith. A humble person sees themselves as insignificant, as powerless. Without God, they are nothing. And so they require God's assistance to do anything or to achieve anything. So even really logic, I think, teaches us that pride is going to diminish faith, but humility is going to make it grow. Now, the rich young man that we read about this morning was one who had to be taught humility. So come back to Matthew. And before Jesus met this young man, we read verse 14 of Matthew chapter 19. And we had this little incident where the children were brought unto Jesus in Matthew chapter 19 and verse 13. And the disciples rebuke the people who have brought these children to Jesus. But in verse 14, Jesus says, "Suffer little children and forbid them not to come to me, for of such is the kingdom of heaven." So just before this event with the rich young man, Jesus has been encouraging children to come to him. And what's the key characteristic of children? Well, just one chapter earlier, we're told about that, Matthew chapter 18 and verse 1 to 4. So at the same time, in Matthew chapter 18 and verse 1 to 4, at the same time came the disciples unto Jesus saying, "Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" So they've got an issue with pride here, haven't they? And Jesus called a little child unto him and set him in the midst of them and said, "Verily I say unto you, except ye be converted and become as little children, ye shall not enter into the kingdom of heaven. Whosoever therefore shall humble himself as this little child, the same is greatest in the kingdom of heaven." So that idea of humility, that's the characteristic of the little children that Jesus wants us to show. So the disciples are arguing about who's going to be the greatest. What motivates that argument? Well, it's always pride, isn't it? No doubt about that. And what's the antidote? What's the key characteristic of children that Jesus wants us to learn? What did children have that the disciples were lacking? Well, it's humility, isn't it? Whosoever shall humble himself as this little child. Humility is the key to discipleship, and humility doesn't want to make me the greatest, as we'll see later. It wants to make others the greatest. So the background to this rich young man is all about pride versus humility. So back to Matthew chapter 19, we're not going to go into this in any huge detail, but in verse 16, one comes and says to Jesus, Matthew 19, verse 16, "Good master, what good thing shall I do that I may have eternal life?" So notice the emphasis, of course, on the word good here. Good master, what good thing? So surely you'd think Jesus is going to be sort of flattered to be called a good master. And yet Jesus stops him right there, doesn't he? And says, "Why are you calling me good?" Now, that seems a little bit unfair to me that Jesus picks him up on this. After all, there's no doubt that Jesus was good, wasn't he? He was sinless after all. He was a perfect man, and you don't get much gooder than that, do you? It's not that Christ was not good. In fact, of course, he calls himself good, doesn't he? "I am the good shepherd," he says in John chapter 10, verse 11 and in verse 14. And yet this is the very thing that Christ questions. He was good, but he said, why? Why are you calling me good? And he really questions the statement, not because it's false, but because he wants to get at what is motivating this young man. Why does the young man call him good? I think it's because that's what he wants to hear Christ tell him that he is. It's like me sort of, greeting the chairman saying, "You're a fine looking fellow, chairman, Sam. That's a great looking shirt you're wearing." The natural human desire, of course, is to hear something similar in return. So I'd be hoping Sam would say to me, "Well, you're not too bad looking yourself. That's a lovely shirt you're wearing too." So the young man calls Christ good because he really wants Christ to say, "Good, you're the good one here, keeping all these commandments from your youth up. That's outstanding." The praise of men, that's what this young man was after. And not just any man, he wanted Christ himself to exalt him in front of everyone. And is in fact so confident is this young man that Mark chapter 10 tells us that he came running up to Jesus. He was so confident, so self-confident, so proud in his own achievements that he ran up to Jesus expecting to receive praise from him. And even the question he asked really reveals that he was anticipating a certain answer from Jesus. He sort of knows the answer to his own question. As Jesus says in Mark chapter 10, "Thou knowest the commandments." You know the answer to this question, says Jesus to him. This was sort of, a real Dorothy Dixie. He sort of knows the answer to his own question, but he wants to hear Jesus say it. He wants to hear Jesus say, "What an amazing example of righteousness, of goodness we have here. You don't need me. You've worked it all out on your own." But of course, Christ, as with everyone, knows exactly what's in this man's heart. He doesn't even let him get away with what is essentially a true statement, "Good master," because he knows it's motivated by this man's pride. Christ was good, but he was only good because of the influence of his Father. And despite his goodness, of course, we know he was completely humble. This man wants to be called good because of doing the good things that he does. But despite his self-perceived goodness, of course, he was filled with pride. So in verse 18, this young man even asked, which commandments? Which commandments does he have to keep? And again, he knows the answer to this question. We can't pick and choose which of God's commandments we keep. We know that. But I think he wants Jesus to enunciate each one so that he can tick them all off. No other gods before me? Tick, I do that. No graven images? Tick, I've done that one. Don't take the name of God in vain. Tick, I know that one. I do that one. He knew them all. He kept them all. He knew he couldn't pick which ones to keep and which ones to reject. But in his pride, he wants to have the praise of men, and particularly this man, Jesus Christ. So verse 20, here's the culmination of this young man's statement. All these things have I kept since I was a boy. Is there anything else I should be doing? What lack I yet, he asks. Now, he wasn't expecting an answer to that question, I don't think. What else could he do? You can't do more than keep all the commandments, surely. And at this point, I think Jesus was supposed to give him what he'd come for, some sort of exaltation in front of everyone. That was the point of the whole exercise from this young man's perspective, for Jesus to be amazed at this young man's goodness. But Jesus does have an answer for him, and it's a very deflating answer. And instead of going away exalted, the young man goes away sorrowful. Now, it wasn't this young man's wealth per se that was going to keep him out of the kingdom. It was his pride. His wealth might have been the source of his pride, but in the end, his pride meant he lacked faith. He was self-reliant. He wasn't reliant on God. He'd done all the good. He had all this wealth to back him up. But what he needed to be saved was faith. And faith is based on humility. He needed to get rid of his wealth and in faith rely entirely on God's providence. His wealth was the source of his pride, his status, his self-confidence. There was no way that he could learn humility with it. And without humility, there was no way he could develop faith. And without faith, he could not be saved. In verse 19, Christ had told him that he has to love his neighbour as himself. And here we begin to see the key to humility. This young man certainly loved himself. Could he extend that same love to his neighbour? If he could, this would be true humility, but it would be difficult. His wealth was really a testament to how much he loved himself and how little perhaps he loved his neighbours. So instead of being exalted by Christ for his goodness, this young man departs in sorrow. What he had thought was his greatest strength was actually his greatest weakness. What he needed was not more wealth or more praise. To the contrary, these things needed to be replaced by humility and a reliance on God. So Christ, in this instance, as always, provides the true answer to the question that this young man should have been asking. So if pride is the enemy of faith, if humility is the basis of faith, the question then becomes not how do we increase our faith directly, because we know the answer to that now, we need to develop humility. The question now becomes how do we develop humility? So the question, the concept, the idea, the characteristic of humility is a tricky one for us, isn't it? We like to claim, especially in prayers, that we're humble, that we're coming humbly before God. But of course, no one likes to be actually humiliated. We want humility, but we don't want humiliation. Humility is the basis of faith because it forces us to trust in God. Pride is the opposite of faith because it's all about self-aggrandizement, self-indulgence, even self-control, which is sort of normally seen as a good characteristic, can be a source of pride. And of the three sort of basic, sins, the lust of the eyes, the lust of the flesh, the pride of life, it's that last one, that pride of life, that I think is the most subtle and the most enduring and the most dangerous of them. I think, as young people, the first two, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, they're fairly obvious sins, aren't they? We want what our body wants. We want what we can see and we can covet. And because those sins are clear and obvious, we spend much of our youth fighting them. But the result might be that the pride of life, which is not so obvious in its control over us, maybe not so obvious in its wrongness, perhaps as a sin, is allowed to take root and perhaps even grow. And often it's not till we're older, when those other two aspects of sin have somewhat diminished their grip on our lives, that the pride of life becomes more obvious to us and we might take up battle against it. So what's the answer? How do we defeat pride? How do we become more humble and so build up our faith all at the same time? They're all part of this bundle, aren't they? What can we do to increase our humility and then so build up our faith? If we can become more humble, our pride will decrease and our faith will increase. How do we do it? Well, Paul has the answer to that in a passage we know pretty well, I think, in the book of Philippians. So have a look at Philippians chapter 2, and we could really spend all morning looking at this idea of humility in the book of Philippians, because it's a strong theme in that book. But we're going to just go straight to Philippians chapter 2 this morning. So again, as I said, these are words we know pretty well. Philippians chapter 2 and verse 5. Now notice as we read through this section, all the synonyms for humility in this section. Paul describes in lots of different ways, but he's really just talking about this one characteristic of humility. So Philippians chapter 2 and verse 5, let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus. So he's going to describe the mind of Christ here, and he wants us to have it as well. Who being in the form of God, thought it not robbery, not something to be grasped at, to be equal with God. So that's one form of humility, isn't it? He was in the form of God, but he didn't think it something to be grasped at, to be equal with God. Verse 7, that he made himself of no reputation and took on him the form of a servant, of a doulos, of a slave. You don't get too much more humble than that, do you? And was made in the likeness of men, not the likeness of God or the likeness of angels, but in the likeness of men. And being found in fashion as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient, like a good slave, like that good servant we saw back in Luke. Unto death. He became obedient unto death, even the death of the cross, the most humiliating death you could possibly die. Wherefore, verse 9, God also hath highly exalted him and given him a name which is above every name. So Christ is our lead, of course, as he is in all things. We are his ambassadors. His exaltation was first based on his humility. A man who had the power to be anything, and yet he doesn't grasp at equality with God. He's born in very ordinary circumstances to Mary and with a stepfather of Joseph, very ordinary circumstances. And he lived the life of a servant to others, a slave to others, in fact. The challenge for Jesus, of course, was to not be the Messiah that the people were expecting, but to be the Messiah that the people needed. He had the ability to be all that they expected in a Messiah, didn't he? A king, a powerful man, a man of boldness and power. Jesus instead takes the form of a servant, of a slave, the Messiah that the people needed. He's the prime example for us of humility. Despite his potential power, despite his goodness, despite his righteousness, he was humble. And we face the same challenge now, don't we? We might expect ambassadors for Christ to be men of faith who look bold and powerful and challenging, sort of charging in where others fear to tread. But what God really wants from us is humility, meekness, and easiness to be entreated. So what about us? How do we cultivate this attitude of humility and so follow the example of Christ and increase our faith? Philippians chapter 2 and verse 3. Let nothing be done through strife or vainglory, but in lowliness of mind, another synonym for humility, lowliness of mind, let each esteem other better than themselves. Look not every man on his own things, but every man also on the things of others. So again, we sort of often say in prayer, we come humbly before God, that we approach him in humility, and hopefully that is true. Hopefully we do approach God with a humble attitude. Only a fairly stupid person would approach God in any other way. But it's not exactly a challenge, is it? Saying those words in prayer is not really an act of humility. It's really just an act of not being stupid. If we can't approach the God who created the universe with a sense of humility, then we've got real issues in our life. So saying that we come before God in humility is really just stating the fact. The test of humility is not our attitude towards the God of heaven and earth, but our attitude towards our brothers and sisters. The test of humility is not our attitude towards those who are greater than us, but our attitude to those who we might perceive to be our equals or even our inferiors. So here's our real answer to humility. Let each esteem other better than themselves. So if it's humility that we're after, and that is what we're after, we really have two options. The first option is that we can keep putting ourselves down, berating ourselves, telling ourselves that we're worthless, and that would result in a humility of a sort, wouldn't it? A sort of lack of self-esteem, I guess, a feeling of low self-worth. But that's not what Paul tells us to do, is it? He doesn't say keep putting yourself down. What we need to do, as Paul suggests we do, is not put ourselves down, but to lift everyone else up. So note the word also in verse 4. We don't ignore our own welfare completely, but we also look out for the welfare of everyone else. We can achieve humility in a positive way or in a negative way. And Paul says, do it in a positive way. Lift everyone else up around you. Don't put yourself down all the time. How do we do this in a practical sense? By looking for the best in others, by valuing their good characteristics, by valuing their strengths, rather than is our perhaps natural tendency to focus on others' weaknesses. Everyone is better than you in some area. Make a conscious effort to acknowledge, either verbally or maybe just in your own mind, that area. Is it their cheerfulness or their love or their patience or their capacity for forgiveness? Is it their evident strength of faith even? Every saint has at least one area of strength. It might be their humility. So how do we know if we're humble? Well, verse 14 of Philippians 2 gives us a simple test. Verse 14 says, do all things without murmurings and disputings. So do we do what we do without murmuring and disputing, or do we do things begrudgingly? Do we attend meetings resenting those that we know haven't put in an effort to attend or at the moment to log in? Do we murmur at the very thought of doing sort of hall cleaning or more than our share of hall cleaning? Are our business meetings without disputing? Do we begrudge the speaker who speaks for too long or the chairman who prays too long? A proud person is constantly finding fault in others. A humble person is always looking for the good in others. Finding fault is going to lead to murmurings and disputings, as Paul says in verse 14. But a humble person is not going to have that characteristic. Finding the good in others will lead to like-mindedness and being of one accord and one mind. What about verse 3 of Philippians chapter 2? Verse 3 says, let nothing be done through strife or vainglory, but in lowliness of mind, let each esteem other better than themselves. It's not just a matter of thinking that others are better than ourselves. The fact is that we have to be humble enough to realise that we need each other, that we won't make it without the assistance of even the lowliest member, in our opinion, lowliest member of the ecclesia. We have to put aside our pride, our stubborn independence, perhaps, that we particularly have as young people, and be prepared to help and accept help from those who we may, in a natural sense, again, see as our inferiors. So again, it's pretty easy to acknowledge, isn't it, that we're not going to make it through this life without God's assistance. That's pretty much a given. But it requires humility to acknowledge that we won't make it through life without the assistance of others. And not just others who we think are stronger than us, but others who we may have considered our inferiors in some ways. And humility, of course, is not something that we can just turn on for ecclesial situations and then ignore in our secular lives. We can't approach God in humility and fail to treat our brothers and sisters with humility. And in the same way, we can't treat our brothers and sisters with humility, but treat other people with arrogance and contempt. If we're to be humble at all, then we have to be humble at all times. And so in daily life, away from the ecclesia, we maintain a humble attitude and place our faith in God. And that means our faith in Him will grow. Humility at work or at school means that we have to suffer ourselves perhaps to be defrauded. Humility might mean accepting blame for something we didn't do wrong, or watching someone else get praised for something that we did right. It may mean someone else getting credit for that group project that we did most of the work for. It may mean treating everyone with respect, including those who we think to be our inferiors in any way, socially, economically, intellectually, physically, and even morally. Just because we, as Christadelphians, know God's position on a moral issue, it doesn't give us the right to denigrate those who don't. Humility means not asserting our own personal rights in the workplace or driving on the road even. It means allowing others to be served in front of us. It means not responding with aggression when we're confronted, whether we're right or wrong. It may mean we lose out financially because we didn't insist on our rights or enforce an agreement. Humility means going against our pride and asking for help when we need it. It means acknowledging that we don't always have the correct answer. It's the ability to say, sorry, I was wrong. Humble is what we need to be always, not just in the presence of God's awesomeness, not just in the ecclesia, but everywhere and always. Humility is the key to faith. The basis of faith is humility. If we can develop humility, we can defeat pride. And if we can do that, our reliance on ourselves will diminish and our reliance on God will grow. Our faith will develop and Christ will recognise himself in us as his ambassadors when he returns. A final quote from Peter, 1 Peter 5, verse 5 to 6. Likewise, ye younger, submit yourselves unto the elder. Yea, all of you, be subject one to another, and be clothed with humility. For God resisteth the proud, and giveth grace to the humble. Humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt you in due time.